Welcome to the Storm Council Analyst Briefs. This episode is entitled, Why Did They Ignore Havana, Galveston, 1900, and Now, the Storm Council Elder.
The Storm Council approaches every hurricane the same way, through four distinct lenses working simultaneously. The observer tracks the physical event, the storm's formation, its path, its intensity, what it did, and how it did it. The Archivist maintains the record, every precedent, every pattern, every time this has happened before, and what we carried forward from it or didn't. As the Council Elder, my responsibility is to govern the Council, holding the analysis to the 7 principles and making sure the evidence speaks for itself. And then there's the Analyst. The Analyst's lens is pointed somewhere different, not at the hurricane, at what the hurricane was always going to find when it arrived. The human systems that are already in place. The settlement and development decisions that were made years or decades before landfall. The development patterns that put populations into exposed zones. The governance structures that determined what got built, what got protected, what got promised, and what got quietly left behind. The evacuation planning, the institutional confidence that turned out to be something closer to institutional mythology. The Analyst reads the target the way an intelligence service reads an installation, identifying vulnerabilities, mapping systemic dependencies, tracing the distance between what a community believed about its own readiness and what the storm's outcomes revealed. The damage from a hurricane is rarely random. It follows decisions, and the Analyst's job is to find those decisions and show exactly how they shaped what happened next. The Analyst briefs are where that work lives. Each brief is a deep dive assessment of a single storm, not a recap of what the Council has covered, but a sustained examination of the human conditions the storm encountered and the decision-making that put them there. They appear outside the Council's regular cadence, between storms, when an event earns the longer treatment. Now listen carefully to what the Analyst says, for her words are cautionary for those that inhabit the coastlines today.
It would be impossible for any cyclone to create a storm wave which could materially injure the city. That sentence ran in the Galveston Daily News in 1891. The man who wrote it, Isaac Klein, was the chief meteorologist on the Texas coast in Galveston. 9 years later, a storm surge 15 feet deep would cross the island where he lived and worked, and between 6,000 and 12,000 people would die in a single night. But the forecast that could have changed that night existed. It was written 4 days before landfall, 1,200 miles closer to the storm, by a man trained in the most accurate hurricane forecasting tradition in the Western Hemisphere. Nobody in Galveston ever saw it. Father Benito Viñas arrived in Havana in 1870 to direct the Belén Observatory, a Jesuit institution that had been watching Caribbean weather since 1857. Over the next 23 years, he did something no meteorologist before him had attempted with systematic rigor. He learned to read hurricanes from their edges, high-altitude cirrus clouds, thin ice crystal streaks that Caribbean fishermen called mare's tails, stream outward from a hurricane center like spokes from a hub. Their angle tells you the storm's position. Their rate of thickening tells you its distance. Their convergence tells you where it's going. Viñas tracked dozens of storms this way, filling notebooks with observations. In 1875, he issued the first documented hurricane forecast in history, 72 hours before landfall. He built something the U.S. Weather Bureau never matched, a forecasting tradition tested by the storms themselves, from a rooftop 1,200 miles closer to where they formed. By the time Viñas died in 1893, his methodology was so trusted that every major shipping company operating in the Caribbean took the Belén Observatory's advisories seriously enough to change course. He'd published his findings, practical hints in regard to West Indian hurricanes, and the U.S. Army Signal Corps had issued it. It sold out 3 printings. His successor, Father Lorenzo Gangoiti, inherited the observatory, the notebooks, and the tradition. Willis Moore became chief of the U.S. Weather Bureau in 1895. In 5 years, he'd expanded the staff, modernized the equipment, increased appropriations from Congress, and established a single principle above all others. The Bureau was the authoritative source of weather information for the United States, not one of several sources, the single source. In 1898, the year the Spanish-American War delivered Cuba into American military occupation, Moore formalized a policy. Cuban observatory advisories would not be carried on the Bureau's telegraph network. Only Bureau forecasts would ride the wire. That August, he went further. He wrote to General Thomas T. Eckert, President of Western Union, complaining that the Bureau has been greatly annoyed by independent observatories securing a few scattered reports and then attempting to make weather predictions and issue hurricane warnings to the detriment of commerce and the embarrassment of the government service. Moore demanded first priority for Bureau transmissions. Cuban weather messages got lowest priority. He ordered Colonel H.H.C. Dunwoody, who controlled Cuba's government telegraph lines under the military occupation, to formally ban all weather messages from those lines, except those sent by Bureau officials. William Stockman, the Bureau officer Moore sent to Havana, enforced the ban locally. The result was what one historian calls an almost total blackout of Cuba. Consider what that meant. The institution with the longest continuous record of Caribbean hurricane observation, almost 30 years, built storm by storm from a rooftop closer to those hurricanes than any American office, had been silenced. Not because its science was questioned. Moore's own correspondence shows that the institutional anxiety wasn't about accuracy, it was about authority. Whose voice would carry? On September 5, 1900, Father Ganguiti observed a large halo around the moon that didn't dissipate. At dawn on the 6th, the sky over Havana turned deep red. Cirrus clouds streamed from the west-northwest in a pattern that Wiens's notebooks made unmistakable. The storm was intensifying and tracking northwest, toward Texas. Ganguiti composed his advisory using the methodology his predecessor had built and tested across more than 2 decades. His conclusion, the Texas coast, not Louisiana, should be the focus of warning preparations. He couldn't transmit it. Moore's blockade, the telegraph ban enforced through military occupation, the Western Union priority order, Stockman's local enforcement, meant the advisory had no direct path to Galveston. It went to Washington. It arrived at 12:47 p.m. on September 4th. Washington was forecasting the storm would curve northeast toward the Atlantic seaboard. The head of the Bureau's forecasting division, Edward Bennett Garriott, would later publish the official analysis of this storm. West Indian Hurricane of September 1st through September 12, 1900, in the Monthly Weather Review. The Bureau's own after-action record documents the sequence. Havana's forecast said Texas. Washington's forecast said not Texas. The forecast that was closer, had more experience, and was correct didn't ride the wire. Both Havana and Washington would eventually predict the Texas coast. The difference was time. Havana said Texas on September 3rd. Washington said Texas on September 7th. The storm hit on September 8th. Isaac Klein had been the chief meteorologist in Galveston for over a decade. He'd built his career on measurement. Barometer, anemometer, thermometer bank, rain gauge, a telegraph key connecting him to Washington. 17 years of reading the sky by its numbers. Moore's policy didn't make it impossible for Klein to learn what Havana was forecasting. The ban covered Bureau telegraph channels, not every source of information in the Caribbean, but the policy ensured that Havana's forecasts wouldn't arrive on the official wire, the channel that carried institutional authority, the channel that told a man like Klein what to prepare for. Klein could have looked, but he had every reason not to. In 1891, Klein published an article arguing that the continental shelf's gradual slope would attenuate any hurricane storm surge before it reached the island. It would be impossible for any cyclone to create a storm wave which could materially injure the city. He concluded that what had twice destroyed Indianola, the Texas port city erased by hurricanes in 1875 and 1886, could not happen to Galveston. The article was cited for years in arguments against building a seawall. Accepting the Cuban forecast would have meant accepting that his published, career-defining conclusion was wrong. That Galveston could be Indianola. That the shelf he'd staked his reputation on couldn't protect the island from exactly what Havana was predicting. The institution had spent 2 years telling him Cuban forecasts were unreliable. His own published work had spent 9 years telling him the threat wasn't real. The two incentives aligned. He didn't look. The wire didn't carry the forecast. And the forecast sat in Washington while the storm crossed the Gulf toward a city whose chief meteorologist had spent 9 years publicly insisting it was safe. September 5th, Washington issued storm warnings for Florida. The word Texas didn't appear. September 7th morning, the Bureau's own pressure readings were finally starting to suggest the track was farther west than predicted. Washington updated, Texas coast, not Louisiana. Storm warning flags went up at the Levee building in Galveston. The message carried no indication of what was actually approaching, because the forecast that had said Texas 3 days earlier was still in a correspondence folder in Washington. September 8th, before dawn. The Gulf waters were in the streets, not draining, rising. The last train left Galveston at 9:15 a.m. By mid-morning, the trestle crossing to the mainland was underwater. 38,000 people were sealed on an island that sat fewer than 9 feet above sea level. The only forecast that had said Texas, sent on time from the right place by the people who knew these storms best, had never left Washington. The storm surge peaked at 15 feet. The anemometer registered sustained winds near 100 miles per hour before airborne debris destroyed it. The telegraph to Washington went dead. One by one, the instruments that connected Galveston to the system that was supposed to warn it went silent. Between 6,000 and 12,000 people died. Six weeks after the storm, Willis Moore wrote in Collier's Weekly, "Probably the Reverend Benito Viñez gave more intelligent study to the investigation of tropical cyclones than any other scientist." Reread that. The man who built the telegraph blockade, who used military occupation authority to silence the institution Vince had built, praised Vince publicly, by name, in a national magazine. He acknowledged that the man whose successors he'd silenced was the greatest hurricane scientist who ever lived. Moore wasn't held accountable for the blockade. He remained bureau chief for 13 more years. He was eventually dismissed by Woodrow Wilson in 1913. Not for Galveston, but for using his office to campaign for a cabinet appointment. The policy was revised quietly in 1902. Cuban forecasts would now travel bureau channels. No institutional statement connected the change to what had happened in Galveston. Whether the revision responded to the deaths, to congressional pressure, or to operational necessity remains unclear in the Bureau's own records. What is clear is that it took 2 years and 8,000 dead to open a channel that should never have been closed. Here's what the public record shows. The Baleine Observatory had been forecasting Caribbean hurricanes for almost 30 years. It was closer to the storms than any American office. Its methodology had been tested, published, and acknowledged by the Bureau's own chief as the finest in the world. Its forecast said Texas. Willis Moore built a blockade because Havana's accuracy threatened his Bureau's authority. Isaac Klein didn't seek the forecast because accepting it would have contradicted a conclusion he'd published 9 years earlier. And between them, between the man who closed the wire and the man who didn't climb over it, a correct forecast sat in a folder in Washington while a city drowned. When a comparable hurricane approached on a comparable track in 1915, the warnings went out with enough advance notice. The seawall had held. Dozens died instead of thousands. The forecast that was closer, more experienced, more proven and correct went into a folder while the forecast that was none of those things went out on the wire. So why did they ignore Havana? Moore had his reason. Klein had his. Both men put their reasons on paper, in policy, in print, and neither man's reason had anything to do with the 8,000 people who never heard the forecast from Havana. Each man's reason weighed more to him than whatever cost he attached to letting Havana's voice be heard. And if you accept that every man in the chain was human first and public servant second, then the answer to the question isn't complicated at all.
Thank you for listening to another Storm Council Analyst Brief. For more information about the Storm Council, visit stormcouncil.com. You can purchase the Storm Council book series at your favorite bookstores, including Amazon. And subscribe to the Storm Council YouTube channel at @storm_council.